Okay, well, as we let people filter in here, we'll go ahead and tee off the beginning of the webinar. Thank you for joining us today. The University of Minnesota at the Humphrey Institute sponsors bi-monthly webinars on election administration, and sometimes we really get into the nuts and bolts. And today we're going to talk about those big philosophical questions. So we're going to go to the other end of the extreme today. Should be a great presentation with Rebecca Green from William & Mary. So you can see there that that's the day and time of the webinar. Please also note that if you would like to ask questions, you can do so at the bottom of your screen. You can also do a live transcript of the conversation as it's happening. Let me talk to you a little bit about the Certificate of Elections Administration program at the University of Minnesota. It is a pioneering program with which we we teach these classes about elections administration with some of the most prominent elections officials in the country to create a 12-hour credit program so that people can gain a certificate in elections administration and really learn about how elections administration works along a whole bunch of perspectives and areas of election administration. It is a completely online program, so you living anywhere in the United States or around the world can take classes during the semester in which they're offered. You can access the professors, access all the materials, and do that completely at your discretion. We have an amazing placement record for our graduates. In fact, a couple of recent graduates just moved to Colorado to start jobs in elections administration, which I'm really happy about because they were fantastic students and they're going to be amazing elections administrators. So it's a really exciting way to get started in a career, or if you're already an elections administrator, to gain more knowledge so that you can be a better one or perhaps move up the ranks. If you want more information, there's a good email address to go to, and I'll show you a slide here that shows how to get to the online application. So there are two ways that you can join the CEA program. You can either go for the full certificate, and there's an application deadline here in the next 6 days, so you might want to look into that and see if that's an opportunity for you. Or if you'd like, you can just try out a particular class as a non-degree seeking student, and anyone can do that. Again, you can learn more by going to those websites or that website or that email. And by the way, I always do this. I don't actually go to that website. I just always put in Google HHH-CEA. If you do that, CEA-HHH, it immediately goes there and you don't have to worry about remembering that you are. The admissions process, you fill out an application, you submit a resume, write a short personal statement, and then you submit the application there. You can see that there's a graduate application process and an undergraduate application process. So you can either be someone who has completed a BA or BS, or you can be someone that's pre that status and just want to go through the certificate program as an undergraduate. All of that is available to you. Some of the classes that are being taught this fall are pretty amazing. Neil Kelly, who is a rock star of elections administration, known worldwide as one of the nation's best elections administrators, he's teaching a soup to nuts class on the survey of elections administration. Should be an amazing class. It goes all semester this fall. So do consider signing up for that one. Larry Jacobs, who's the director of the Center of Politics at Humphrey, is teaching the Strategic Management of Election Administration course. He's the guy that deals with the big questions of democracy. And in fact, I think he would get a real kick out of what we're going to learn about today. Also this semester, Tammy Patrick is teaching data analysis for elections administration. So let me tell you, if you were to cherry pick one person on the planet to do data analysis, collecting data, running data, and using it to solve your problems, it would be the amazing Tammy Patrick. So That would be a fantastic course to sit in on. And then starting half semester, so this is not starting in September, but starting in late October, Jennifer Morrell is teaching physical election security. So that's everything from protecting your systems, protecting your offices, protecting your personnel. And of course, these questions have become much more important over the last couple of years. And we have a course dedicated to that on physical election security. So please look up on our webpage, and the easy way to get there, CEAHHH, and look into these courses, and maybe you even sign up for the whole certificate program. If you sign up for one course, or one this semester and maybe one next semester or in the summer, you can always come back and then apply for the full program and get the certificate later. So there's no downside to going with individual courses or going ahead and signing up for the full certificate. All right, so let's invite in Rebecca Green. So you see her there on the screen. She is the Associate Professor of Law and Co-Director of the Election Law Program at William & Mary. I don't know, why is my name here? I'm not a speaker, I am just the moderator. But I will be curating the questions that you are posing in the chat or in the QA. And please do that as we go so that I have some great things to ask Rebecca. And let me hand it off to her. Rebecca?
Great, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be invited, Judd, so thank you for thinking of me. And thank you to each of you for being engaged in making our elections stronger. So my goal today is to lay out my attempt to try and take some of the pressure off of our election system. I conceived of the idea to write about adversarial election administration last summer, right before the 2022 midterms. At that time, I don't know if you guys remember this, headlines were blaring with a lot of hand-wringing about how partisan election deniers were going to take over elections. There's a lot of headlines to that effect. And I looked around and I thought, you know, if the polls are right that 70% of Republicans distrust election outcomes, what happens if 70% of Democrats decide that elections in states run by these candidates can't be trusted? You know, it seemed to me like that would be a pretty worrisome picture. We'd be left with significant doubts on both sides about election management. And I thought maybe part of the problem is that the narrative that you can't trust elections run by partisans has been a chorus of reform for years. Partisan election administration in the United States is a common punching bag, which is sort of understandable because the United States is the only advanced democracy that puts partisan sort of overt partisans in charge of elections. So we're a major outlier in this respect. And this is no dig at all to nonpartisan election administration, which I agree should be, you know, the goal. Although, as I'll talk about, I think it's very difficult in practice. In any event, I started to wonder if this reform drumbeat of nonpartisan elections, or partisan elections being the problem, might be negatively impacting public trust. And what seemed to be coming into focus is the idea that I can't trust elections run by somebody whose politics I disagree with. And that seemed like a really bad situation to be in, given the volatility of elections that we're experiencing. So in thinking about ways to build confidence in our system of elections, I started to wonder whether partisanship might be getting a bad rap. So if you look at our system of elections, partisanship is built in like crazy on purpose. At every level of election administration, you have state laws requiring active participation from members of rival political parties. And this is so for reasons I'll elaborate a bit on later. It's so because it improves transparency, it improves accountability, and it improves public buy-in of election results to have rival partisans involved at various levels of our election system. And so just like we rely on the adversarial system in the judiciary to ensure fair outcomes in court, we do the same in elections. And I think this fact has been under-recognized. I think there's value to taking the sting out of partisan participation in elections and suggest sort of a plucky counter narrative that it's something to be celebrated. There are certainly downsides and challenges, which I'll discuss, but it seems important to me that the concept of rival participation of partisans is both deeply American and purposeful in ways that are underappreciated. So I'm going to lay this out in 3 parts. First, I thought we'd look at why, as a historical matter, US elections developed with partisan actors throughout. Second, I thought I'd offer a brief look at the role that partisans play in US elections today. And then third, I thought I would talk about some challenges to leveraging this adversarial model in election administration that make it really hard in practice. So just sort of starting off with the history, I'm not going to dwell on the history or kind of go into this. I will provide at the end of this presentation, I'll give you a cite to an article I just wrote that kind of does a deep dive into this history if you're curious. But I thought I'd just sort of hit the main points. I wanted to first add a huge caveat that I'm making really broad generalizations. There's obviously huge variations in election administration throughout history in how states and localities run election. That was true and historically, it's true today, as I hear you're going to learn about in your next session. So anyway, take this history with a grain of salt. But historically, partisans weren't part of the election system. They were the election system. County and local officials had roles, but parties printed ballots. They got their voters to the polls. They took leading roles throughout the process. It was a sort of a partisan effort, and with very little or limited involvement formally from the state. I don't know. I guess it could be said that it's as a result, but I think there are a lot of reasons why. But you know, historically, elections were characterized by a lot of debauchery. You see paintings of this where there's sort of these drunken and violent scenes. There's some really colorful descriptions of this happening sort of throughout early U.S. history. And it really wasn't cleaned up until the progressive era in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The biggest reforms that you can point to are the secret ballot and formal voter registration. These 2 innovations required that states take on significant parts of the voting process and to specifically take them away from political parties. So, for example, with the secret ballot required states to print ballots, which gave rise to ballot access rules and figuring out who gets on the ballot, and essentially a huge shift in power away from parties to the state. This was a period when state election codes expanded significantly as states sort of took this power away. But progressive lawmakers in the states left in place structured rival partisanship all over the place. There were roles for rival partisans in Black letter law throughout the code that exists today. So some examples, I'm not going to go through this. You can read pages and pages of this in this paper if you're interested, but you can think, for example, of partisan election boards at the state and local level where you have explicit requirements for members of the 2 major political parties to be represented in various ways. You also had sort of these overt partisan checks throughout the process through challengers and observers and so forth. If you look at why, I think the thinking was twofold. First, nonpartisan elections were not possible, as colorfully put by a historian named Charles Beard. Progressives understood at the time that eliminating political parties was a vein flying in the face, this is a quote, a vein flying in the face of the hard and unpleasant facts of life and a vain longing for the impossible. Second, I think progressives understood that involving partisans had benefits. Progressives hoped that roles for partisan rivals would decrease the impact of partisan monopolies, that it would increase transparency, and that it could break through what was then at the time a political party spoil system. I think it's worthy of note that this did not, in fact, work. Even after progressive reforms at the turn of the century, party machines still sort of stole the show. Thought I would show you a quick slide to demonstrate this. Give me a second. I'm going to key up my slide presentation. It's amazing how you do this so many times and you can never quite get it right. But anyway, here's this quote I hope that you're seeing my slide presentation, but here's this quote from Joseph Harris, a historian from the era. So the idea here was that there was this complicated network of rival partisans that were supposed to be in place to keep each other in check. And yet, as this quote demonstrates, it wasn't exactly working. During the Jim Crow South, there was no meaningful partisan competition to speak of. Of course, the South had its own flavor of single party domination. It was racist. There was no meaningful rival partisan checks in the face of terrorist violence. But again, the root of the problem wasn't partisan involvement per se. It was single party domination, arguably, of the election process, sort of not enough adversarial checks. So if that's sort of the history of where we came from, I thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking about adversarial partisanship in elections today. So today, partisans still play explicit roles in US elections by statute, as many of you I'm sure are aware, not just partisans, but rival partisans in many parts. Our system features partisan parity rules from top to bottom. For example, we have partisan parity requirements on state level election boards. I have another slide to give you a flavor of that. Pull that up. You can see here on this slide that, these are states that in their statutes have explicit rules for either partisan membership and sometimes partisan balance. Hawaii has this kind of interesting nonpartisan tiebreaker model, but this is just to give you an example of what it looks like to have partisan parity requirements. This is for state level election boards. Of course, this model kind of goes right down through rival partisan staffing vote counting tables and observers hailing from opposing political parties. There's just tons of examples of this. So, our system is still designed to leverage rival partisans in many ways. The idea being that rival partisans at various points in the election process will keep each other in check, that they will provide a transparency mechanism. So even if you have, for example, a board where you'd be outvoted, let's say you have a board that has, 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats, and you might think that that would mean that the Republicans on the board would be powerless. There's some interesting scholarship that identifies a red flag function that the minority members can play in that situation, where the presence of rival partisans at least allows that minority group to call out problems and make those public. Studies of federal agencies and their partisan structures have also suggested that the presence of rival partisans has the effect of moderating decision-making, even in situations where there's partisan imbalance. Another reason why adversarial election administration is put in place is because the feeling is that people will be more likely to trust outcomes when their partisan representatives are actively involved. I love the story that Jennifer Morrill told me. I can't remember the jurisdiction, Judd, maybe you'll know, but the election workers, so the observers would kind of come in the room and the election workers would all be wearing red and blue vests to indicate which political party had appointed them to work. So you could look out and sort of visually see this in action. And it made it sort of a more trustworthy election system to know that there was this sort of bipartisan, or I shouldn't say bipartisan, adversarial partisan participation. I think another place you see this often.
That's Denver, by the way. That's
Denver. Judd knows. I knew you would know, Judd, and that's there you go. So I think that's like an awesome example of the way that adversarialism can build trust. I thought I'd also just give the example. If you think about if you've ever seen a recount take place, that at each of the tables there is both major parties are poring over ballots. And that's explicitly intended as a check to allow the public to trust that just like in the court system, sort of the truth is emerging. So if there's sort of this dream that adversarial partisans are going to keep each other in check throughout the election process. You may wonder, why is the US system not a model for democracies all over the world? Why doesn't everyone do this? And I think the answer is in part that adversarial election administration suffers from a series of weak links. So I thought I would hit just some of the main ones that, that I've come up with. I'm sure there are many others. But let's start with this. Let me share my screen again. So the first is the partisan CEO, the chief election official. As you can see from this slide, most states put a partisan chief election official in charge of elections. And just to show you how they're selected, here's a slide just to give you a sense how in most states those are elected positions, so they're campaigning actively for these roles. I think this creates a perception problem to the extent that a partisan CEO, it sort of doesn't have an adversarial check in place. Where I am here in Virginia, our CEO has a bipartisan or a multi-partisan board overseeing her work. And so, it's not to say that if you have a partisan CEO that there are no adversarial checks. In fact, there are quite a few, but at least from a perception problem, it may seem unfair. I think that at the very least, in instances where you have a unitary CEO, partisan CEO, that there should be strong conflict of interest rules to prevent, for example, CEOs campaigning for candidates running in elections that they are overseeing, or even partisan CEOs running for office themselves while they are in charge of running elections. It seems to me like that would be an easy fix, or at least a way to fix the perception, or at least reduce the perception problem. Second, there are real problems in achieving true partisan parity. If your goal is to populate election staff with members of rival partisan parties, there's a geography problem, particularly a political geography problem. If you look at this slide, it gives you this sort of sorting picture where Americans have just kind of sort of self-segregated politically. I don't know how else to sort of describe it, but this type of political geography makes it really hard to recruit rival partisans in areas where you have a strong leaning on in one direction or the other. One of the really interesting lawsuits in 2022 happened in Maricopa County, where apparently Republican workers trailed Democrat workers by 18% prior to the 2022 midterm. The RNC sued on trying to enforce partisan parity rules in that jurisdiction. But it's sort of interesting to think about the challenges that political geography plays. Relatedly, recruitment is quite difficult, even aside from political geography problems. Of course, the threat environment and pressure that election officials are facing makes it much harder for election offices to find people who are qualified to get involved. We've all seen the headlines about staffing shortages at election offices, and I think partisan parity is really hard to achieve in this environment. Another problem is that we don't really know how big this problem is, because states and localities are not required to report this information. In other words, what the partisan makeup is of their election workers, even down to poll workers recruited to work on election day. I would love to see that data. I would love to see states start collecting it. Another challenge in this bucket is weakened political parties. Parties are being bypassed by small dollar donation schemes. And of course, there's a lot of political science writing about weakened political parties, but it plays a real role in making adversarial election administration harder to pull off, because it relies on parties to put forward qualified candidates for various roles. And if those parties aren't strong, that becomes much more difficult. Another category of difficulty or challenge is what you can think of as adversarial breakdown. So you have this situation where the two parties are really splintering. This is perhaps most pronounced on the right at the moment. It's also, of course, happening on the left to some degree. But you have Republican election administrators in states like Arizona and Georgia that over the last several years have found that their sort of partisan rank and file don't believe them when they say that, our election has been run fairly and try to show their work. And this is sort of this breakdown of trust within political parties, which of course dramatically weakens the adversarial system that we have in place. And then finally, I thought I'd just mention this other challenge to an adversarial process, which is a rule of law breakdown. So an adversarial system, of course, requires two strong parties playing the game. I'm not a big fan of sports analogies, but I'll use one here. If you have a sports match, we expect that both teams are going to play by the rules. We know that they'll duke it out and play hard, but they'll follow the rules of the game. They will, if it's offsides, they will, take whatever the referee tells them to, and proceed. If one party is committed to winning at all costs, rules be damned, then the adversarial system doesn't function. What does this look like? To sort of not accept the rules, I think refusing to accept judgments of courts, refusing to accept outcomes of elections, sidestepping legal guardrails. One example of this is when Tina Peters in Colorado, to use Colorado again, as an example, allowed uncredentialed actors to inspect voting machines. Election systems feature many ways to register concerns and lodge objections. These range from informal to all the way up sort of to courts. So if you're not committed to staying within those bounds, the adversarial system can't hope to function. If you have sort of destructive, bad faith and illegal actors running around, that really dooms the adversarial process as well as other guardrails, of course. But I thought I'd rather conclude on a higher note than that. I had an opportunity to serve as an observer in Fulton County in Georgia last November in the lead up to the midterms. And I don't know if you recall, but there was a lot of bluster in the press about likely chaos at the polls in 2022. And I spent 2 days touring polling places and counting centers in Fulton County, and a few things stood out. So first, I honestly have never felt prouder to be an American. It felt great to be among so many people committed to seeing the democratic process through. It literally, the entire time I was there, was calm, it was friendly, it was orderly. One of my favorite parts was at the main counting center where absentee ballots were being processed. We went there the morning of election day. And there was this row of election workers, probably a total of 10 working in teams, where one was a Republican and one was a Democrat. And they were inspecting ripped ballots that had come, the ballot, the machine that opens the absentee ballots had on occasion ripped a ballot. And their job was to follow this very careful protocol to duplicate the ballot so that it could be counted. And as you watch them work, each member of the team was paying intense attention to their job. They were making sure to get it right and to agree at each step. And sort of there it was in front of me, having sort of been working on this project over the summer. It was adversarial election administration in the flesh. And it suggested to me, it sort of reinforced what I had been writing about, which is that potentially partisans aren't the problem. We actually might need more of them. So that's it. That's all I've got. I'd be really happy to hear your comments or answer questions. And thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. Really interesting stuff. So I'm going to throw what I think is the hardest question at you. It's my question, and so I'm taking speaker's rights to ask the first question. And that is, isn't this all just a big fiction? Isn't it the case that unaffiliated or independents are basically partisans in disguise? They've chosen not to tell people that they are partisan, but they themselves are partisan. So constructing a system around non-partisans is just constructing a system where you don't know where their partisan leanings are, that they are themselves partisan, they're just hiding it.
Yeah, I mean, I think my response to that is that that's right. And so when you have systems like in Canada and much of Europe and many other places that are allegedly nonpartisan election administration systems, that, that isn't really necessarily what's happening. You're sort of closing your eyes and plugging your ears and hoping for the best. And that's really what I'm saying, is that in the United States, we're sort of clear-eyed about the fact that people are going to have partisan passions. And what I'm suggesting is kind of doubling down on leveraging that adversarial partisanship and, and sort of making sure that you have these rival partisan checks throughout the process to kind of address the reality that you will have partisans in place running elections.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, I'll go to the other extreme. So there are two states that I'm aware of. Maybe there are others, but two that are sort of prominently this way: New York and Indiana, which require duplicates in every position. So, for instance, in New York, every county has a Republican county election director and a Democratic county election director. The state office has a Republican state election director and a Democratic state election director. Indiana is the same way, although I think the system is somewhat different. But and I don't mean to sound critical, but my understanding of those systems is that because of the partisanship, because of the fact that everything has to go through two people, it kind of bogs the system down. And it makes for difficult change. Change is hard to incorporate. So what do you think of that sort of extreme side of the model?
Yes. So I think I'm really glad you asked that question. And I think that sort of cheerleading for adversarial election administration is one thing, but how it's structured is a very different thing. And I think there's no question that one of the biggest criticisms of, rival partisans taking place is this problem of gridlock, which, in the systems that you just described, it's a perfect example of that not working. We had a great example of this outside of the election administration context here in Virginia, where we had a redistricting commission that was populated with equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans to draw our lines in 2020. And it was, they ended up hiring a Republican line drawer and a Democrat line drawer. They were advised by a set of Republican attorneys and Democratic attorneys. And it was just, it was clearly the plane was not going to even take off. It was just not even a possibility that ended up getting thrown to the Virginia Supreme Court. So I'm not arguing necessarily that, for a specific kind of model of adversarial election administration. I'm more arguing that as a check and balance, it should happen throughout in order to ensure sort of public buy-in of results. But I think the question of, getting bogged down or even, bringing the process to a halt in various places is a real one that people need to think through.
Okay, so now I've gotten a series of the same questions. So I'm going to pose it the way that I'm thinking of the question, but I've gotten this question several times, which is, as the world has become less identified by parties, so our US population, more and more people are identifying as independent or unaffiliated, depending upon how your state works. I could just say personal experience. In Colorado, we are at 47% unaffiliated now.
Yep.
So 47% means it's like 26 and 27 for partisans. Yeah. So we have this gigantic percentage of people who are unaffiliated. And because of the way that the system is constructed, the positions go to partisans because we've created this, you got to have a Democrat and Republican to do every major function. Yeah. Well, doesn't that sort of segregate the independents or the unaffiliated out of the election process and create a different kind of problem?
Yeah. Okay. I love this question. So great. So one of the critiques that I got early on of this project is like, wait, what about third parties? And sort of, if you're just taking the top two major political parties, aren't you leaving a lot of people out? And I think that sort of speaks to the question a little bit. But I think it's more the case that unaffiliated voters are, they may lean one way or the other, but they're just not willing to sort of come out in a way that sort of the more partisan among us do. So the way I think about this is how the court system handles the situation. So by which I mean, let's say you have a major environmental dispute where you have, members of a community who are suing a large company for polluting them. So the way the court system funnels that dispute is through this adversarial process where you have a plaintiff and a defendant. Now, it is absolutely the case that many other people who are not the plaintiff and not the defendant are, adversely affected or somehow affected by that dispute. They do not have a seat at the table. They do not have a role in the adversarial court system. Everything is funneled through that plaintiff and defendant. And I think of this as being the same way. In other words, that unaffiliated voters should take, comfort in the fact that you have adversarial partisans who disagree heavily on, from a political standpoint, engaged in administering elections in that same kind of representative way that plaintiffs and defendants do in court. So it's building on this sort of adversarial process to provide checks for everybody that justice is being done. That makes sense.
Yes. But let me take that to the next step. So again, sort of tapping into a couple of different questions that we've received. And you, by the way, mentioned this in passing during your presentation. What if the partisanship on one side or the other is not itself representative of a larger population?
Yeah.
And I think you can probably see where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
And by the way, you mentioned an example, Tina Peters, an example in Colorado, where she had a pretty extreme position, which I don't think represents the position of Republicans, at least wholesale, in the county that she represented. So what do you do in that extreme?
This is really hard. And I'm not sure I have a good answer other than to say, if the two major political parties, which is how most state statutes that have roles for partisans explicitly laid out in their statute, will say something to the effect of, somebody from the top two vote-getting political parties, and sometimes they'll key it to, the votes in the last election. And that's how the rival partisans are identified. In other words, electoral success as a political party. But you do have this problem where the person who is appointed by sort of one faction within a party isn't, on board with, or isn't somebody who's going to be able to build trust among the party writ large, or from some significant part of the party. And I don't have a good answer for that, other than to say that I think it's important that political parties think big when they're making these kinds of appointments or thinking about how to populate election staff, in the sense that they should be including all different parts of their partisan makeup, making an explicit if you take, for example, what's happening to the Republican Party, take a bunch of Trump supporters and put them in roles that will allow them to take part in the process. And I'll tell you anecdotally, I'll just tell you a story here in Williamsburg, just to kind of make the point. In Election Day in 2020, this was after Election Day, after during the canvassing portion of it, we had a guy come in who was positive that the election had been stolen, that the wrong, that everything had gone wrong. And the reaction of the election administrators was to bring him in and walk him through exactly what they were doing and show him everything. And by the end of it, he said, "Wow, this is really great. This is really well run." And I'm not Pollyanna. I don't think that that's going to happen all the time. But the point is, I think there's nothing to fear from involving different factions within a political party in election administration, with the hope that it will be educational and help promote trust of the system writ large.
So this is, it's funny you had that experience, because I think there are dozens, perhaps 100 plus elections administrators on this call right now, and they probably all had similar experiences to the one I'm about to describe, which is I have routinely gone and joined the call queue, especially post 2020 election. So in December and January and February after the election, I was in the queue a lot. And so I would take calls from people who would express great doubts in the way Colorado or perhaps other states had conducted their election. And over the course of a 20, 30, 40-minute phone call, you could sort of, in some cases, draw them into a better conception of reality and the way things actually work.
Yeah.
But it really is like a teaspoon in the ocean. I mean,
Yeah.
there are lots of people out there that
Yeah.
you're not getting your opportunity to talk to.
Yeah.
And then even those that you do talk to, as soon as they talk to somebody else, they're gone. So
Yeah.
how can, sort of pivot to another kind of question in the
Yeah.
same genre,
Yeah.
how can you use what you're trying to talk about
Yeah.
in the misinformation
Yeah.
area and maybe try to draw people back into believing in outcomes?
Yeah. So I think there's a real distinction between sort of the voter or just member of the public who is voicing concerns about how elections are run and the interface that election officials have to play in trying to kind of educate and inform and help the person feel more confident in the system. So I think that's a dialogue that's separate from what I'm talking about, and not discounting it at all. It obviously has to happen. What I'm talking about is actually bringing people onto the workforce, right? Either as temporary workers or, part of election administration, where they're trained on how elections work. They're shown where the guardrails are. They're, paired up with people who they disagree with politically to administer the election. And I think that it's a very different thing when somebody is, sitting in Fulton County watching, absentee ballots be duplicated carefully. I think it's a much harder, you're just seeing it. And so I guess what the premise of this idea is that when you are engaging in it, for a whole day or for, a career or for whatever, that you're actually, there's a certain amount of buy-in that you get just sort of seeing it up close and personal, as opposed to trying to explain to somebody over the phone how everything works. Do you know what I mean? So I guess I just sort of make that distinction. And I think I 100%, I hear the doubters in the world saying that, it's not, that's Pollyanna speaking, but I've seen it to some extent in person, and I think it's powerful.
Well, but what other option do we have, really? I mean,
exactly.
the person is standing in front of you, or they're on the phone to you.
Yeah.
They're asking a question in a webinar. You got to take the question. You got to
100%.
take the issue and try to work them through it.
100%. I think that for far too long, we have focused on voter education as being where's my polling place, and how do I register, and that kind of thing. Voter education, that's individualized, sort of how do I vote. I think voter education should be much more comprehensive, where people learn about the guardrails in place to protect elections and how elections actually work, and what the steps are. Just because I think that would, if people understood, on a one-to-one basis, sort of how things unfold and how they work and where the protections are put, that it would be useful in terms of public trust.
So I'm going to pivot a little bit to a different kind of question.
Yeah.
So we've gotten a couple of questions about how would a nonpartisan model work in the United States, and then in fact, one questioner is asked specifically about the Hawaii model, which has this sort of nonpartisan makeup plus one person. You know, so doesn't that create a condition where you've really put all this power into a single unaffiliated or single person?
Yeah.
And isn't that also kind of what's happening in many of these commissions that are drawing lines for congressional redistricting?
Yeah.
And doesn't that sort of defeat the whole kind of democratic premise of all of this?
Yeah. I really struggle with this. I was part of the group of people trying to think about how to restructure our redistricting commission. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this exact problem of you can design a very elaborate process, but in the end, are you consolidating power in a way you didn't intend? So I think this is really tricky to do. And I think the American system where we have this sort of laboratory of democracies idea where, we try out lots of different ways to see if anything sticks, is, probably our best hope in terms of learning about how to do this. But I think there are lots of interesting ideas out there, interesting practices out there. So for example, if you're worried about for example, a unitary partisan CEO having too much unchecked power, you might imagine there are ways that you could get that partisan CEO in place that might make you feel more comfortable. For example, having supermajority appointment requirements in legislatures, so you couldn't have just a bare majority of legislators placing the person in. I think there's lots of interesting sort of ways that you can leverage supermajority requirements in various ways to try and find people who are more likely to be moderate in a charged environment. But this is tricky. I don't have any easy answers here. I wish I did.
Well, and so this doesn't really lead to a question, but I know many of the folks that are from Wisconsin or have some understanding of what's happening in Wisconsin. And first, I'll as a premise, I will say I have extraordinary respect for Megan Wolf, who's the state election director. She is a close personal friend of mine. So perhaps I'm somewhat jaded on the way that things are going in Wisconsin. But the fact that they are in a situation where, because the two parties can't find any common ground whatsoever,
yep,
they are basically in permanent limbo up there. And then they've got this a rather unusual or new and controversial court opinion, which has created this limbo land for appointed positions.
Yeah.
And so the supermajority, I know the supermajority thing sounds good. It's one of those things that looks really good on paper.
Yeah.
And then you get into the real world and it's really hard to apply because there's just not a lot of crossover between the two parties now. Yeah. I would also note that this was lined up to be the case in Maryland, where Linda Lamone, after 30 plus years of amazing service to the state of Maryland, recently retired, also a dear friend of mine and an amazing elections administrator. She was also in a situation where she had a board, that board was even. And when she retired, the concern was that they would not be able to come to some agreement as to who could replace her. Yeah. They were able to come to an agreement, and they have been able to replace her. So it is sort of subject to the sort of conditions on the ground.
Wisconsin is a really interesting example because the Wisconsin Government Accountability Board that was set up. When was it set up? Like 2014, I want to say, something like that. Anyway, it was seen as Dan Takagi, who's a prominent election scholar, wrote this great article called America's Next Top Model about the Wisconsin General, the WGAB, because it was, this beautiful example of how you can take partisanship out of election administration. And, of course, it completely crashed and burned because of, circumstances, I think, outside of its control, given the political climate in Wisconsin and Scott Walker's recall election. You can read about it as like a very fiery death for that particular experiment. But, at the time, it was sort of hailed as this, idea of how to do nonpartisanship right. And I asked Dan about, this paper and about this idea. And he said that his thinking had really evolved and that he thought, it was the case that you couldn't really rely on a nonpartisan model in the kind of political climate that we're in, and that what we should be thinking about is ways to achieve impartiality, acknowledging that partisans are in place. So I think it's really difficult. And I think the situation currently in Wisconsin is an illustration of what I was suggesting at the end, where you have just such splintering within a political party that it's almost ungovernable.
Yeah, and to make this somewhat personal for a moment, I am one of the few, I may be the only state election official who is a classified employee. So I'm a civil servant, which means that I don't sort of come and go with the secretaries. The problem with the partisan model of course, is that if you are in a state where it's relatively close and you find you're getting some Republican secretaries and some Democratic secretaries, or if you're in a board setting, you have some Republican governors and some Democratic governors, you find that there's a lot of rotating through of people that do my job and jobs similar to mine. And for that reason, it's really hard to get traction. It's really hard to find a direction to achieve good policy ends, regardless of which direction you're going. You don't make any ground because you're only in that position for 2 years or 4 years before somebody else rotates into that position.
And I think that's a real weakness, because if you think about institutional knowledge and the role that plays in doing a good job as an election director, I mean, I think that kind of consistency is, critically lost when you've got people coming in and out. Then again, there's an argument to be made for, shaking things up and kind of keeping things fluid.
Shaking me out.
No,
So,
I'm suggesting.
well, I feel like, so I'm in my 15th year now. I haven't quite made it to 15, but I feel like I'm starting to get pretty good at the job. I mean, it's taken me a while, but I think I'm like the 5th, 6th most senior election director in the country, and that's ridiculous. There should be people that are many more. I'm in the middle of my career. There should be many more people that should be more senior than me.
Yeah, I mean, if there's anything that I'm worried about right now, it's the loss of institutional knowledge as people are leaving. It's literally tragic and irreplaceable, and I'm really worried about the impact it's going to have.
So I'll end on one more question, which is kind of a sort of a corollary to all of the things that we've been going down the road toward. Peggy Reeves, a very close friend of mine, the election director in Connecticut, or former election director in Connecticut, but she's back with the office doing some work. And then another person from Connecticut note that there are sort of third parties which are assuming more dominant roles in the conversation, potentially on the ballots. We have the no labels, which potentially could put a person on the presidential ballot. And then Connecticut itself has a very strong, I'm going to say third party, but really in numbers, it's a second party, right? It's the party with the second most registrants in the state. So what do you do with a model like that? And how does that relate to sort of Europe, where there are, 10 parties or 6 parties or 4 parties, or Canada, or I mean, all of these sort of models sort of collapse once you get outside of that 2-party structure.
Yeah. Well, again, I think this is where kind of experimentation comes into play, and the idea that, luckily in the United States, we don't have to do things all the same way. And I think there's a lot of interesting room for, innovation and thinking about ways that you could think about the adversarial model involving more than 2 sides. So, I think that I think there's work to be done. And I think, again, the idea that partisans can and should be involved may be helpful in that environment where you're not as worried about seeming nonpartisan when in fact you're trying to devise rules that are explicit.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Fantastic. I really appreciate you taking time to talk to us today.
Happy to.
Let's see if I can get back to my screen here. This will be a trick. I think I did it. Okay. So you should see on the screen now that more about our Certificate of Elections Administration program at the University of Minnesota. I told you all that before, but feel free to go seek more information from that email below. There are sign up right now for the full certificate program, or you can try to take a class. And I mentioned the 4 classes before. Neil Kelly's teaching a class. Boy, I wish I had time to take all these classes. And Larry Jacobs has a class on strategic management. Neil's, by the way, is basically the soup to nuts survey of elections administration. Tammy Patrick is teaching a class on data analysis and elections administration. That is also a full semester. These first 3 are full semester classes starting after Labor Day. And then the last one is mid-semester. And so it's a half a semester course, so you wouldn't start until October. And that is Jennifer Morrell's physical election security class, which will be a fantastic class. Just a heads up that the next one of these webinars is Cameron Wimpy, the assistant professor of political science at Arkansas State University. He has been researching rural elections administration, and he has lessons from the Mississippi Delta and beyond. And it's really interesting. I've sort of seen a preview of this. First of all, he's fantastic, and he's really done some amazing research. But just the idea of trying to differentiate between elections administration in the South and sort of elections administration across the United States, it's very different. And it really makes you think about, are we all doing it essentially the same? And turns out the answer might surprise you. So that is our next one, and it's October 11th at 11 a.m. Central. So that would be noon Eastern time. The registration will be open soon, but please mark your calendar because that one's coming up in October. Here is where you can find more information about the CEA program, and you can find a recording of this if you want to go back and listen again to what Rebecca had to say and the questions. It'll be posted in a couple of days at our website, and you can sort of scroll down to where it says Rebecca Green's webinar. Thank you again. Really appreciate it. It was a wonderful session. I appreciated all the questions, and we will see you on October 11th. Bye.